everyone disagrees on what the real Bitcoin DeFi is.
I don't consider wrapping a Bitcoin and putting it onto Ethereum into Aave. That's not Bitcoin DeFi. That's not like Bitcoin DeFi. Or having a multi-sig layer 2, having some kind of DeFi activity on a layer 2 that does not inherit Bitcoin layer 1 security is also not Bitcoin DeFi. In my opinion, again, Bitcoin DeFi means DeFi activity happening on Bitcoin layer 1. That's how I identify it.
The bulk of Bitcoin DeFi demand will continue to come from the best applications, wherever those are. They may be in Bitcoin L2s. They more than often, end up in other ecosystems.
There's one thing you really want anyone listening to take away is this whole, oh, that's wrapped. That's not wrapped. Well, if you remember, I think it's the first episode of Mad Men, they're talking about how to differentiate some cigarette company, and they're like, our tobacco, it's toasted, and people are like, well, all tobacco is toasted, and they're like, yeah, but we say it. So look, without a soft fork, every Bitcoin bridge is wrapped. Everything else is marketing.
We want to do it completely trustlessly, so without any wrapping or bridging, so that Bitcoin is completely native, locked in this vault, which is on the Bitcoin chain.
The thesis that we have is that we want to reuse Bitcoin capital. There's a north of $1 trillion asset, mostly sitting locked up in cold storage and other places and not actively deployed. So we want to make it easy to deploy that capital. And that's where our mechanism for moving BTC from L1 to L2 kicks in. We call it SBDC. So the L2 BTC is called SBDC because obviously it has different security properties from your L1 Bitcoin.
I don't quite know what is the distinction between sidechain and L2 and the various, so I don't know.
Over the last 2 episodes, we've gone over the long history of experimentation on Bitcoin, from the very early attempts with counterparty and colored coins to the explosion of NFTs and meme coins during the Bitcoin Renaissance. All those experiments point to one idea, that Bitcoin can and should be more than just digital gold. That Bitcoin is in fact the foundation for an entire new, parallel, and decentralized financial system. Today, that idea has a name, Bitcoin DeFi. But when we interviewed a dozen builders in the space and asked the following question, what's Bitcoin DeFi? We learned the answer is far from straightforward. In this video, episode 3 of our Beyond Digital Gold docuseries together with StarkWare, we'll take you on a journey to discover what the real Bitcoin DeFi is. To understand the ecosystem today, we need to look at how different builders answer that question. And it starts with the simplest approach. The first and still largest form of Bitcoin DeFi is also the simplest, wrapped Bitcoin. In this model, a custodian holds real Bitcoin in reserve and issues a token representing that Bitcoin on another blockchain, most commonly on Ethereum. That token can then be used in decentralized finance applications like lending protocols, DEXs, and liquidity pools. For years, this was how Bitcoin entered the DeFi ecosystem. Today, more than 8 billion worth of Bitcoin exists in the form of wrapped tokens on Ethereum alone. The largest of these is WBTC. At its peak, WBTC held more than 280,000 Bitcoin, making it one of the largest Bitcoin custodians in the world. And it powers a huge portion of Bitcoin liquidity in DeFi. But this model comes with a big trade-off. You don't control your own Bitcoin. And that Bitcoin even on Ethereum, it's sitting in custody somewhere else, namely with a company called BitGo, which means at the end of the day, you're trusting BitGo to hold it. Some, like David Se, who is building Bitcoin staking protocol Babylon, argues this is a huge trust assumption. And it's why such a relatively small amount of BTC is wrapped today.
If you look at the numbers, existingly, there is 2 major wrap asset, Bitcoin wrap asset. One is called WBTC and the other one is CBBTC. And if you add up the percentage of the Bitcoin supply which are in these wrap asset is about less than 1%. Less than 1% of total Bitcoin is in this wrap asset. And so I think I call this a trust bottleneck because of the trust you need on the entities that issue these wrap assets, the supply is kind of throttled.
In other words, you don't control your own Bitcoin. Instead, you're trusting a third party to custody it. What you hold is kind of like an IOU against BTC, a representation of it. UBTC, CBTC, and others are Ethereum tokens that can be used in Ethereum DeFi and effectively borrow and earn interest against them. But for that Bitcoin wrapper to hold its value, you need to trust that custodians are taking good care of it and that the representation can always be redeemed for the real thing. The next step in the evolution, try to reduce that trust. Instead of a single custodian, what if a group of institutions collectively control the Bitcoin? This is the model behind federated sidechains. In these systems, Bitcoin is locked in a multi-signature wallet controlled by a federation of trusted entities. That federation then runs a separate blockchain where Bitcoin can be used for applications. The best known example is Liquid, launched by Blockstream. Liquid allows users to move Bitcoin into a sidechain where transactions are faster and assets can be issued directly on the network. Another example is Rootstock, or RSK. Rootstock runs an Ethereum-compatible virtual machine anchored to Bitcoin. Rootstock is today the largest federated Bitcoin chain, with over 100 million in TVL. Together, these systems represent some of the earliest attempts to build programmable environments around Bitcoin. But again, there's a big trade-off. Security now depends on a federation of entities. If enough members of that federation collude, then they control your Bitcoin. And for many Bitcoin purists like Eril Benari of the BRC 2.0 protocol, that's a deal breaker.
Like we have Ethereum, it's like you can do a lot of things trustless on it. Like why settle for trust minimized on Bitcoin? On Bitcoin, it needs to be trustless as well. Otherwise, we come back to your question, like just use Ethereum, right? Like why do all the things try to do it on Bitcoin?
For builders like Eril, the key question is always the same. Does the system inherit Bitcoin security or does it rely on something else? If it's the latter, then to them, it's not really Bitcoin DeFi. To address that criticism, a new generation of systems replace those federations with decentralized networks. Instead of trusting a fixed group of companies, these systems distribute custody across hundreds of independent operators using cryptography. These are known as threshold bridges. One of the biggest examples is TBTC, a system where Bitcoin custody is controlled by a decentralized network of nodes. Instead of a handful of institutions signing transactions, control is distributed across many participants. The idea is to reduce trust by spreading it across the network. But critics argue that the core issue still remains. Bitcoin itself is not enforcing the bridge. Matt Luongo, Bitcoin OG building the Bitcoin DeFi app Mezzo, explains.
But what matters, all that really matters with all of that is that whatever proof has to go the other way can be committed back to the Bitcoin chain.
In other words, you've reduced trust, but you haven't eliminated it. And that brings us to the fastest growing part of the ecosystem today, Bitcoin Layer 2s. Bitcoin Layer 2s are blockchains designed to bring programmability to Bitcoin, while anchoring their security on Bitcoin Layer 1. They allow developers to build applications while using Bitcoin as the underlying asset. These systems aim to combine two powerful things, Bitcoin security and Ethereum-style smart contracts. Today, there are dozens of projects exploring this idea. Stacks, Botanics, POB, Bitlayer, Citrea, Mezzo, StarkWare. Each is taking a different approach to the same goal, unlocking Bitcoin's massive capital base for financial applications. But they're still far from that goal. Together, these networks represent about $200 million in TVL, compared with $55 billion in Ethereum DeFi. But they're not deterred. On the contrary, most builders we've talked to see this as an opportunity. The thinking is, it's still early, and it just makes sense that financial applications built on blockchain technology should be leveraging the largest, most liquid, and by some measures, most decentralized chain, and that's Bitcoin. The problem is, while everyone shares the same ambition, which is to build programmable environments for financial applications that can verify transactions and secure them on the Bitcoin blockchain, in the same way that Ethereum Layer 2s work, while everyone wants that, Bitcoin was simply not designed for it. Because it's impossible to verify and secure computation directly on the Bitcoin chain, developers are working on a few alternatives. One of the most prominent ones is BitVM. BitVM is a type of bridge which would allow complex computations to happen off-chain while still letting Bitcoin act as the final court of appeal if something goes wrong. In practice, this means a system could run a full programmable environment somewhere else. But if an operator tried to cheat, anyone could force a dispute onto Bitcoin itself and prove that the computation was incorrect. That mechanism could finally allow something much closer to an Ethereum-style rollup to exist around Bitcoin. But BitVM is still in its very early stages. The concept was first introduced in 2023 by Robert Linus, and while it has sparked enormous excitement across the Bitcoin developer community, it remains largely experimental. Researchers and teams are actively exploring how to build practical systems on top of it, but fully functional rollup-style implementations are likely still years away. For now, BitVM is best understood as a roadmap, a glimpse of how Bitcoin could eventually support far more complex applications without changing its core protocol. Some developers believe another path could unlock much more powerful Bitcoin Layer 2s, upgrading Bitcoin itself. One proposal gaining attention is the reintroduction of an opcode called OPCAT. OPCAT was part of Bitcoin's original scripting language, but was disabled early in Bitcoin's history. If reintroduced, it could allow Bitcoin scripts to verify much more complex computations directly on-chain. That could make it far easier to build Bitcoin rollup-style systems that inherit Bitcoin security without relying on external trust assumptions. But like many proposals to change Bitcoin's base layer, OPCAT remains controversial and far from guaranteed to be adopted. So for now, Bitcoin Layer 2 builders are using workarounds in the same way we've seen devs have had to do for years. Projects like StarkNet, Bitlayer, BOB, and Citrea are rollup designs that assume BitVM-style verification will exist. They use some type of bridge to wrap Bitcoin onto programmable chains.
Would be wow the first team achieving this kind of Bitcoin settlement as a Bitcoin real rollup. As I mentioned, it's Bitcoin security, it's Bitcoin settlement, we're paying fees to the miners. So that's quite different kind of infrastructure setup compared to the current Bitcoin sidechain kind of systems.
Among the teams exploring Bitcoin Layer 2s, StarkWare represents one of the most technically ambitious approaches. Instead of relying on custodians, federations, or signer networks, StarkWare's approach focuses on cryptographic proofs. The idea behind proof-based systems is that most of the work can happen somewhere else, not on the base layer. Transactions and applications run on an external execution layer. But instead of asking users to trust the operators of that system, the system produces a cryptographic proof that mathematically shows that everything was executed correctly. That proof is then verified by the base blockchain, which today is Ethereum. But StarkWare's research direction is about making something similar verifiable by Bitcoin in the future.
Right now, the validation of these proofs can happen only on Ethereum, but we are still bound. So the state of StarkNet, the whole sort of network, does not advance if a proof is not verified by, an independent decentralized network, which currently is Ethereum. In order to have a set of approvers be on Bitcoin rather than Ethereum, that would require, either a BitVM bridge or or even better, something like OPCAT that would allow us to put our proofs to be verified on Bitcoin. We are anchoring our security on Bitcoin in the strongest possible sense that is possible today.
Okay.
So today we're relying on multi-sig bridges. We are working as quickly as possible to deploy the Alpen bridge, which is a BitVM style bridge, and doing research and advancing or trying to advocate for OPCAT so that we can use the Bitcoin, mining network in order to be the voucher and validator for our Stark proofs.
For StarkWare, the long-term vision is a system where Bitcoin remains the ultimate source of security, even if the applications themselves run somewhere else. Other teams are solving the programmability problem using different architectures. building systems that anchor to Bitcoin in different ways. Some create entirely new execution layers. Others use Bitcoin itself as an economic security layer. Stacks and Botanics, for example, represent a different answer to the same question. How do you extend Bitcoin without changing Bitcoin?
When you look at some of these other ecosystems, over there, people wanted to do interesting things with blockchains, but they end up starting a new economy and sort of like a separate ecosystem. It's like their own island, right? They're building their own island. They have to bootstrap it. They have to figure out capital. They have to figure out sort of like security, budget for it, and so on. Whereas what we are saying is Bitcoin already has $1 trillion of capital. Can we just focus on bringing that capital into the L2? Similarly, Bitcoin already has, the highest hash power and security budget out there. Can we just reuse that security budget to secure the L2? And I think that's how we sort of like stand out compared to like, any new L1 that someone is trying to start today, because it's like a massive kickstart, both in terms of security and in terms of the capital that people can use.
And in September, we actually launched our Bitcoin yield product, what we call STBTC. We believe that's the massive differentiator between what a Botanics is and any other EVM chain, in essence. When you think about, for example, Ethereum layer 2s, all the gas fees and transaction fees go back to the signal sequencer, of course. Since we are a decentralized operator set, we actually share the gas fees, which are in Bitcoin. And that's how the yield is generated. So you've always got the classical meme of the goose that is screaming like, "Where is the yield coming from?" We got an easy answer from the gas fees and transaction fees on Botanics, which are in Bitcoin.
What we can gather then is that Bitcoin developers are seemingly exhausting any possible way they can find to tie their chains back to Bitcoin, grabbing onto Bitcoin transactions, creating decentralized pegs, creating all sorts of bridges. They represent one of the most ambitious attempts to solve the central challenge of Bitcoin DeFi: how to make Bitcoin programmable without sacrificing the security that made it valuable in the first place. While some builders are trying to move Bitcoin into new execution layers, others are exploring the opposite, keeping Bitcoin exactly where it is and using it to secure other systems. The idea is sometimes called Bitcoin shared security. That's what David Say of Babylon is building.
Yeah, Babylon is basically a cross-chain protocol, okay? So it is building on Bitcoin in the sense that it's focused on using the Bitcoin asset. But the use case of Bitcoin happens on another blockchain, So to give a concrete example, we already launched a year ago a protocol called Bitcoin staking. So Bitcoin staking allows Bitcoiners to deposit the Bitcoin in a UTXO, which is essentially the technical name for an address on Bitcoin, and then use that Bitcoin as a staking asset to secure another blockchain. And that blockchain is a proof of stake blockchain. Why is this productive? Because now the Bitcoiners can earn yield based on the service that's providing to the proof of stake chain. Because as you know, like if you stake ETH, the ETH will earn yield, staking yield. Similarly here for Bitcoin, number one. Number two is it is completely trustless. So this Bitcoin is not deposited into any third-party wallet to control. The entire Bitcoin is controlled by the Bitcoiner, and security is through a so-called slashing condition, which is entirely programmatic. So if you stake and secure the blockchain and you don't do anything bad, then your Bitcoin is completely intact.
In this model, Bitcoin remains on the Bitcoin blockchain, but its economic value is used to secure other networks. The concept is similar to Ethereum's restaking movement, where assets are used to secure additional infrastructure. It's another way of making Bitcoin productive without moving custody away from the Bitcoin chain. And finally, at the far end of the spectrum are builders who believe Bitcoin DeFi should happen entirely on Bitcoin itself. No bridges, no sidechains, no new blockchains, just Bitcoin. That's Ariel Benari's idea.
We basically upgraded it. It's not like future of it, but BRC20, the 2.0 upgrade, actually happened on February 3rd. It's more like a technical upgrade on the indexer side. But the BRC20 tokens, like BRC20 is not a token protocol now. It's a full-fledged programmable meta protocol. So you can have stable coins on Bitcoin. You can have RWAs on Bitcoin, DeFi on Bitcoin, any kind of thing you can have on Bitcoin with 10-minute block times. That's still there. It has its own advantages and disadvantages. I'm not gonna like go deep in, but the point is now we can inscribe smart contracts on Bitcoin, and basically like this is a new asset class in the ecosystem. Like Bitcoin native assets was like Ordinals BRC20 runes was Bitcoin native assets. That's how the ecosystem calls it. But now we have this programmable Bitcoin native assets. So Bitcoin didn't participate in this before.
This philosophy treats Bitcoin as a data layer, a permanent ledger where financial systems can be built directly on chain. It's the philosophy behind protocols like Ordinals and BRC20s, where the Bitcoin blockchain itself becomes the foundation for new applications. This approach requires the lowest trust assumptions, but it's also limited for the reasons we've said before. Bitcoin is slow and expensive for the kinds of transactions required in payments and trading, for example. And most importantly, it's not built to run computation. So, which of these approaches is the real Bitcoin DeFi? We believe the answer is all of them, because Bitcoin DeFi isn't a single architecture. Instead, it's a spectrum of trust assumptions. Whether they want to put their Bitcoin in the hands of custodians, federations, a smart contract bridge controlled by a multisig, to systems where you trust distributed networks and cryptography, or systems that aim to trust nothing but Bitcoin itself. In the end, Bitcoin DeFi is about a simple question. Who are you willing to trust with your money? Right now, there are many different options. Many of them are waiting on the next evolution of Bitcoin and using workarounds in the meantime. Maybe those upgrades will come. But as we've seen in this documentary series, history shows it has not paid to bet on Bitcoin changing. What has worked, though, is when developers push through those boundaries and work with them instead. There's another way to look at the ecosystem, not through the lens of trust, but through the lens of utility. What can you actually do with Bitcoin once it enters DeFi? Whatever definition you want to use.
Well, usually, if you have an asset that has a lot of value, and a lot of people have Bitcoin that has a lot of value, you would like to put that thing into work economically, like as opposed to just sitting there. So with real estate, with a house, you may take a mortgage against it and then, invest that and generate extra yield.
And that's exactly what we'll explore in the next episode. Because once Bitcoin enters DeFi, the possibilities expand dramatically. Lending, trading, yield. Entire financial systems built around the world's most secure asset. And in the next episode, we'll show you what people are actually doing today with their Bitcoin.